Word to the warning. Things are about to get quite brutal and dark as we get into the last 200 years of Ukrainian history, and with the exception of a brief period, it is really not going to get any better. These next few parts will include some pretty dark themes, so I just wanted to give you a heads up. But on a more positive note, I'm exceedingly proud to announce this series and my channel's newest affiliation, United 24 Media. Check out their channel that I have tagged in the video description for more information, videos from experts and news. I want to flat out say that I am not receiving any payment for this affiliation. I am excited to partner with this team though, both now and with some future projects that I hopefully have planned. Now without further ado, let's get into it as we trace Ukraine's history from 1830 through to the establishment of the first independent Ukraine. The 19th century found the Russian Empire at the very height of its power, with its dominion stretching from the Canadian Rockies to the eastern border of Prussia. As 1830 drew to a close, on the outside it appeared to be the premier power in Europe following the fall of Napoleon, with the British Empire itself setting the policy that Russia was now the true enemy to focus on, and not France. But, and there is a big but, the Russian Empire was not an empire of Russians, not entirely. Within its borders there were, to name but a few, Poles, Finns, Kazakhs, Azeris, Georgians, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Belarusians, and of course, Ukrainians. The policies set in stone during the reign of Catherine the Great were a time bomb. Instead of destroying these cultural groups, Catherine laid the very groundwork that would ensure the death of the Russian Empire and the relegation of the Romanovs to the dustbin of history. For the Ukrainians, the end of Napoleon created a particularly interesting situation, where the traditional western Ukrainian lands found themselves now under the rule of the Habsburg Empire in Vienna, while the eastern lands, including Kiev, were under the rule of the Russian Empire. Although separated by a land border, the crossing between east and west was about as watertight as the Titanic. I've been avoiding a pretty complex topic in the telling of Ukrainian history so far, and that is that of the Ukrainian Catholic Church and its relationship with the Orthodox Church. I won't go too deeply into it because although it is important, I don't want to lose you all with 30 hours of religious talk, but the issues really began as far back as the Kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia, when it looked to the Catholic West for help. The Catholic Church continued to grow in prominence during the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, never displacing the traditional Orthodoxy, but growing nonetheless, particularly in the western regions around the city of Lviv, namely the regions closer to the Catholic power base in Warsaw. The Ukrainian Catholics weren't just your regular run-of-the-mill Roman Catholics though, as their religion is syncretized very heavily within Orthodox Christianity and Catholic Christianity, as it was on the borderlands of both. The Russian Tsars outright refused to abide the Ukrainian Catholics and attempted, quite often forcefully, to bring the, in their eyes, wayward little Russians into the fold. The Kaiser in Vienna though, well, he had a different approach, and under the new title of Byzantine Rite Catholics, the Uniates, as they were titled, thrived under the Austrian Habsburgs, accepted and allowed to practice their own faith freely. The Austrians didn't just do this out of the goodness of their hearts though. It was an entirely political move. Both Austria and Russia had the same problem. Poland, only recently divided and then for a brief moment free under Napoleon's Duchy of Warsaw. Polish nationalism was not going away anytime soon, and it was a potentially very dangerous problem. The Russian approach, as we will continue to see, was to brutally suppress anyone who wasn't a Russian, and treat anyone else as a simple little Russian who needs to change to fit the mould. The Austrians, on the other hand, playing off the past few hundred years of conflict, decided that they would promote Ruthenian culture as an alternative to keep the Poles in check. This is something that would cause significant conflict and absolute horror over the next 100 years. And so, this is where we find ourselves, in 1848, with the Ukrainian world divided, and with revolution brewing across all of Europe. The liberal revolutions across Europe in 1848 would bring to a head the brewing nationalism and liberalism that had been smouldering across Europe since the French Revolution. For the first time, Germany began to be considered as, well, Germany. The Italian state's days would now truly begin to be numbered, as a unified Italy now seemed to be an inevitability, and in Austria, everything would seemingly fall apart as the multi-ethnic empire, dominated in the east by Hungarians, rose up with the Poles soon seizing the opportunity to rise as well. The Ukrainians, now being referred to as Ruthenians by Vienna, paid back their newfound freedoms and loyalty, and after some time, which I won't go into here because this is the history of Ukraine, not the history of the revolutions of 1848, the revolutions ended. In Germany, these revolutions were absolutely crushed, and this left a power vacuum which gave way in short order what would become the German Empire with Prussian dominance. In Austria, an agreement was made, founding the new state of Austria-Hungary with a dual monarchy. The Ruthenians would be rewarded with their loyalty by being completely recognised by the Kaiser, and receiving recognition within the empire as a whole. However, the Polish nationalists wouldn't forgive or forget the Ruthenians for siding against them, and this conflict would continue to fester, both on religious and ethnic lines. The Ruthenians who lived west of the border therefore saw the Poles as their biggest enemy, at least domestically and politically, as both sides vied over who had the rights to the region and the great city of Lviv. But the freedom of Lviv, away from Moscow's rule, provided a location for Ukrainian cultural works, plays, and poetry to flourish. I have been calling the Ukrainians who lived in the Austrian Empire Ruthenians for the last few minutes. I've done this to help differentiate across the different sides of the border, but make no mistake, these were Ukrainians. With the Ukrainian culture flourishing in Lviv, the ideal of a united Ukrainian nation became more and more popular. The biggest evidence as to just how powerful the Ukrainian identity now was is seen in their written language, with the Habsburg Ukrainians resisting all attempts to enforce a Latin alphabet upon them, retaining Cyrillic against the odds. To the east, in Russian-ruled Ukraine, the situation was rapidly changing and getting worse for those who called themselves Ukrainian, with the Russian leadership cracking down on those who spoke the Little Russian dialect, as they were now calling it. Russification was now reaching a point that Ukrainian, the language, was considered just a mere dialect of Russian, and in 1876, Tsar Alexander II banned the import and publication of Ukrainian texts and works. The idea of the Russian Tsardom was now that Ukraine's very existence was a direct affront to the safety and continuity of the empire. Possibly the greatest example of the fight back against the destruction of culture was that of Taras Shevchenko, a poet, artist and writer who published one of the now most famous poems to ever come from Ukraine. In 1848, Shevchenko published his Testament, which is so powerful and so strong and so important to our story that I will now read it in full. An example of how strong this publication was during the first ever performance of the Ukrainian national anthem still within the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Shevchenko's portrait was on display. When I die, then mark my grave, high on an ancient mound, in my own beloved Ukraine, in stepland without bound, whence once mace wide-skirted wheatland, Dniepro's steep cliff shore, then whence one may hear blustering river wildly roar, till from Ukraine to the blue sea, it bears in a fierce endeavour, the blood of foemen, then I'll leave, wheatland and hills forever. Leave all behind, soar up until, before the throne of God, I'll make my prayer, for till that hour I shall know naught of God. Make my grave there and arise, sundering your chains, bless your freedom with the blood of foemen's evil veins. Then in that great family, a family new and free, do not forget with good intent, speak quietly of me. Shevchenko and his contemporaries would suffer greatly for their nationalism, and in 1847 he was arrested and convicted of the crime of promoting nationalism through his writing, with Tsar Nicholas I himself approving the sentence. Shevchenko would find himself force-marched to the east, to the Urals, ordered to serve as a private in the armed forces. I can't stress enough just how vital these poets and writers were to the preservation of Ukrainian culture and identity. You may have noticed that for some of these episodes, I have opened them with excerpts of the Ukrainian national anthem. The Cossack episode in particular, which I opened with the chorus, will lay down our souls and bodies to attain our freedom, and will show that we brothers are of the Cossack nation. What you may not know is that this is the period in history where that anthem has its origins, written in 1862 by Pavlo Shcherbínsky. The poem that would develop into the nation's anthem was immediately taken up by Ukrainophiles, and for this, Pavlo was exiled to Arkhangelsk for the crime of writing a song that got popular. These are just two examples of artists who helped ensure that Ukrainian culture would survive against the odds, but make no mistake, there were many more. In 1854, the illusion of the invincible Russian Empire was shattered when Sevastopol fell to British and French forces during the bloody Crimean War, with the death of Tsar Nicholas I occurring not long after, in 1855. The Crimean War changed everything for the Russian Empire, as it proved without a shadow of a doubt that its military was woefully ill-prepared for war, fielding wooden sailing ships against the immense ironclads of the Royal Navy and the French Navy. The Russian Empire needed ships, trains, factories. It just needed to industrialize. So poor was the infrastructure that the first railway ever built in Crimea was actually built by the British during the war. The later half of the 19th century would see a profound growth in the region's wealth and industry, as the Russian Empire desperately tried to catch up to the rest of Europe. Ukraine's position on the Black Sea coast, along with its fertile land, rich with mineral wealth, positioned it to be at the very core of this industrialization, with the expansion of great shipyards such as that at Mykolaiv, rail links from north to south and east to west. As these railway connections were finished, the cities of Ukraine would explode in population, with Kyiv itself growing by a factor of 10 from 1830 to 1900. The Industrial Revolution had finally come to the cities, but make no mistake, the rural and agricultural lands still remained much as they had been for a significant period in history. This period of industrial growth wasn't just internalised, it also encouraged migration and investment from abroad, with significant investments coming from Welsh businessmen in the development of metallurgical plants in central Ukraine. As with all industrial booms, the rapid population growth created a bit of a problem for the ruling powers. But across Russia, people left their homes in the thousands, desperately looking for work in the new industrious Ukraine. Two people in particular found their way from Russia to Ukraine to find work in what would be today considered highly dangerous jobs. One of them was a man by the name of Ilya Brezhnev, who would go on to have a son called Leonid, and the other was none other than Nikita Khrushchev. This period is where Ukrainians started to truly become minorities in their own cities though, as Russian peasants en masse made their way into Ukrainian towns and cities. According to the 1897 Russian Imperial Census, approximately 3 million Russians and 17 million Ukrainians lived in the land of Ukraine, 17 to 1, in favour obviously of the Ukrainians. But in the cities, it was a 60-40 split favouring the Russians. The Russian government of this time was highly supportive of this policy of what can only be described as settler colonialism, as it provided a counter to Ukrainian nationalism and the nation-building process underway across the steppe. With the population explosion and mass migration of the Russian peasants, many Ukrainians simply saw no more future for themselves in their homeland, and they made their way abroad to the United States and to, at the time, the British Dominion of Canada. Many of those who left their ancestral homeland for the United States were of the Jewish minority, who simply just found no place for themselves in the Russian Empire. The coming of the 20th century saw a very different Ukraine than barely 100 years before. Ukraine was now very much two nations due to the policies of Russification and the Industrial Revolution. The urban city centres, now dominated by Russian migrants, saw the very real possibility that the Tsars would get their wish, as Ukrainians found themselves more and more relegated to the rural areas and the forest steppe. And across the south, a new divide occurred, with the industrial power of the nation now centred around the Black Sea coast. It seemed as if there would be a continuance of the policy, and that in Russian-controlled Ukraine, it was now a matter of when, not if, Ukraine would die and would be subsumed into Russia. But history is a fickle thing, and in 1905, everything would change. On the 9th of January 1905, a very cold winter morning by all accounts, 20,000 workers and members of their families began a march from the outskirts of St. Petersburg towards the centre of the city. Led by Father Georgy Gapon, with the workers holding a portrait of their emperor, the goal being presenting him with a letter asking for his protection from brutal bosses and representation as a constitutional parliament. As the demonstrators approached the Winter Palace, the army, loyal to the Tsar, opened fire, shooting at the protesters holding the Tsar's very own portrait, killing more than 100 and wounding up to 500, and sending a shockwave around the Russian Empire. The revolution took 3 days to reach Ukraine, and once again Kyiv led the charge, with the South Russian machine building factories workers declaring a strike, and from here it spread in all directions. The peasants rose up, cutting down trees and forests belonging to the nobility and raiding mansions. In June, the battleship Potemkin in the Black Sea revolted, most of its crew Ukrainian, the revolt over being fed off meat in their borscht. The crew killed their officers and sailed to Odessa to support the revolution ongoing in the city. In October, the revolution reached its peak with a railroad strike and 120,000 workers, paralysing the empire. The Tsar would change his tune, granting basic civil rights and allowing Parliament to give people a say. In the west, inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the situation meanwhile between the Poles and the Ukrainians was reaching a boiling point during the local elections, with riots resulting in several deaths. Further elections in 1907 saw the defeat of the Russophiles, who made their way into the region, and Ukrainian language was guaranteed its independence. The revolution in the Russian Empire, though, only seemed to speed up the process of Russification, with the further banning of the Ukrainian language at schools and the harassment and closure of all those who attempted to publish in their native tongue. On the contrary, Russian propagandists were encouraged and given free rein to spread their message, and they dominated the Duma's elections. The situation was that things were now going from bad to worse for the Ukrainians, and with their language banned, their culture suppressed, and their ostracism from political life, it seemed as if the Little Russian scheme was going to win. But 1905 did leave a seed planted in the minds of Ukrainophiles that there was a chance, and it wasn't a foregone conclusion. Although, at the very least, it would take a monumental earthquake in the region's geopolitics should the Ukrainians have any real chance at freedom. And in 1914, it came. Ultimately, it would come down to just 2 bullets, fired by a Serbian nationalist to completely change the trajectory of Ukraine and the world as a whole. Just 2 bullets, fired in one of history's comical accidents after the driver of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand took a wrong turn. It is hard to fathom just how large this small event truly was. Of course, it wasn't the only reason the First World War started, it's just the trigger. In reality, the war had been brewing for decades, with the German Kaiser obsessively attempting to challenge Britain at sea. France was wanting revenge from their humiliation in 1871, and the Russian leadership desperately needed a win to reinforce their authority after the disastrous defeat to Japan in 1905. The world truly was a powder keg in 1914, and after the assassination, everything came to fruition. But unlike the British or French, Ukraine was stuck on both sides. On the one hand, you had the heavily Russified lands of the Russian Empire, being told to bear arms and go to war, and on the other, you had the Austrian-ruled Galicia, on a knife edge, already with secular violence, but loyal to the Kaiser, who had given them freedoms. The initial stages of the war did not begin well for the Central Powers, at least in the east, with the German army retreating from positions in East Prussia, and the Austrians from positions in Galicia. For the Ukrainians who came under the rule of the Russian army, their situation grew more and more perilous by the day, with the Russian minority now thrust into positions of power and a proverbial war declared upon Ukrainian culture. Russian rule over Galicia, though, would thrust into the spotlight the Ukrainians within Austria-Hungary, and units would be formed wholly consisting of Ukrainian soldiers. In 1915, after an extensive period under Russian rule, Galicia was liberated by a joint Austrian and German offensive. With the liberation came the fleeing of all those who purported Little Russianism, and for the first time, it appeared that Ukraine might have a future, free of interference from the Tsars, as part of a wider empire under the Habsburg crown. In 1916, though, the Russian army returned, led by Brusilov, in the offensive that has now taken his very name. This crushing offensive recaptured significant parts of Galicia, and it appeared that this offensive may well buckle if not break the Central Powers line. The matter of fact, though, is that the Brusilov offensive was not the case of Russia getting its act together and winning the war. Rather, the Brusilov offensive was the final last gasps of a dying empire. In March 1917, the Romanov dynasty, if not the Russian Empire as a whole, came to an end, not with the crash of cannon fire, but with the stroke of a pen. Exhausted psychologically after years at war, and already having been a rather weak ruler, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne, offering it at first to his brother, who declined. The dynasty that had ruled for centuries came to an end due to the adept maneuvering of the once loyal Duma and an increasingly angry working class who were fed up with life under imperial rule. The February Revolution, as it would become to be known, came as a complete surprise for many of the pro-Ukrainian groups, who were dumbfounded by what they should do. On the one hand, the Duma had taken control, and was apparently organising free and fair elections to form a democratic nation, and it appeared that there could be a chance to position a future Ukraine as an autonomous region within the Russian sphere, yes, but with guarantees placed on making sure the Ukrainian language was maintained, through education and reform to the strict laws. On the other hand, there were a significant group of Ukrainians who saw this as their chance for a free and independent Ukraine. Mikhailo Rashvetsky was one of these key people, who believed that this was their chance, and he set to work with his colleagues out of sight in Kiev in a basement, preparing a future Ukrainian government. They created his General Secretariat, headed by Vladimir Rudnytsky, a leading modernist writer at the time who managed to garner a significant readership in both Ukrainian and Russian. The new government claimed jurisdiction over a significant portion of modern Ukraine, including Kiev, Podolia, Volhynia, Chernihiv, and Poltava. In July, the Provisional Russian government took the step of recognizing this government, founded in a Kievan basement, as the regional government of Ukraine. Ukraine would now find itself in a limbo, nominally part of Russia, but for all intents and purposes acting completely independently. But how did we get here? In 1905, Ukraine had been put under the boot heel. How in such a short time did we go from the prospect of Ukraine from dying completely and entirely to relative independence? It really comes down to the decisions made by the Tsars in the lead up to the declaration, in particular the decisions to go to war, at first with Japan and then with the Central Powers. Ukrainians wanted an end to the war and an end to the constant death due to the orders of the Tsar, and the provisional government's policy of unity and peace was addictive. It brought the Ukrainophiles who wanted above all independence into the forefront of the region's politics with the backing of the people. Many prominent Ukrainians would take the chance to return to Kiev from Russia, including Serhii, who was a talented, internationally recognized artist. He would help design the symbols of state of the new Ukrainian nation. For these designs, he would look to the past, adopting the historical colours of Galicia Volhynia, yellow and blue, and the trident of Vladimir the Great. Not everything was going well for the new republic though. The artists and writers who had been so essential in retaining Ukrainian culture now found themselves living the romantic dream of leading a nation, and they were woefully ill-prepared. They failed to take advantage of the thousands of military personnel who declared for the new republic, and in 1917, the lack of a functioning Rada and a loyal army would prove disastrous, as the Bolsheviks in the Russian-dominated cities started to seize control away from the republic. The Bolshevik coup in Russia led to the declaration of the People's Republic of Ukraine, which claimed the lands including Kursk, Kherson, and effectively all those settled by ethnic Ukrainians. But the cooperation between the Bolsheviks in Russia and the People's Republic in Ukraine broke down, and akin to their coup in Russia, the Bolsheviks attempted a similar coup in Ukraine. This coup failed, but in response, the Ukrainian Republic of Soviets was declared in the east, based in Kharkiv, and in January 1918, Russian Bolshevik troops crossed the border and marched towards Kiev. On the 22nd of January 1918, the last major decree came from the Rada, declaring Ukraine's independence in an attempt to gain German support as an independent actor. This was the first official breaking with Russia since Ivan Mazeppa. The Ukrainian soldiers would now engage the Bolsheviks, attempting to hold them off from reaching the rail lines to Kiev. 27 of these men would be captured and executed. Today, these men are considered the first, but definitely not the last, martyrs for an independent Ukraine. On the 9th of February, the Rada abandoned Kiev, retreating west and signing an accord with the Austrians and Germans, who were now invited to intervene militarily. With the German and Austrian states cut off by sea from vital trade routes, having access to the breadbasket of Europe was a dream come true, and in short order the Central Powers advanced. The Bolsheviks could simply not stop this advance, and the German army broke through the Russian lines, forcing them from Kiev. By the end of March, the Rada was back in Kiev, and the dead were buried with full state honours. The Bolsheviks were in full retreat, fleeing south and east and declaring makeshift people's republics wherever they could, Odessa being just one, and these republics only existed truly on paper. The Central Powers simply ignored these attempts and advanced into Crimea, and further to the east, pushing the Bolsheviks entirely from Ukraine. Their forces broken, the German and Austrian armies unstoppable, Trotsky's hands were now tied. The Bolsheviks, led by Trotsky at the negotiations, first tried to declare in a moment of extreme arrogance that the war was over. Trotsky's thought process was that if the Germans continued the advance, that the workers of the world would suddenly rise up in anger at the sheer insult of the German army advancing into the workers' state. Not surprisingly, this kind of arrogant approach did not work, and the Germans were quite literally apoplectic with rage at the sheer ego of Trotsky, and they continued their march forward. Eventually the Bolsheviks would sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and it was all seemingly over in the east. With German backing, the independence of Ukraine was recognized legally by the Bolsheviks, and it seemed that after all of these years, the rebellions, the tribulations, Ukraine was finally, and forever, free. 4 months later, American and Australian forces marched forward at Le Hamel, signalling the beginning of a new kind of combined arms warfare, led by General Monash. The German forces broke and retreated. A month later, the Allies attacked again, and for the next 100 days, the German army was beaten, broken, and destroyed. It was very clear that our story is far from over. That brings us to the end of part 4. It is now 1918. Ukraine is independent with German backing, but Germany is failing in the West. The next part will cover the interwar years, and yes, it will cover, in depth, the beginning of, if not the entirety of, the Holodomor. Thank you again for watching, and thank you U24 Media for partnering with me. Seriously, go check out their channel and their work. It's no shock that I believe in their purpose and their mission to keep Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian news alive, free and independently. Like, comment, subscribe. Thank you again for watching, and I'll catch you next time.